We will now move to the motion before the House this evening, which is, this House would embrace an ever closer African Union. I now look to the first speaker, Graduate Officer of the Oxford Union, Dr. Garang Dutt, St. Catherine's College, to open the case for the proposition.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, a popular African proverb has it that until the lion learns to tell its story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Ladies and gentlemen, may I add that until Africa has an effectively closer union, the lion won't only fail to tell its story. The lion will also continue to remain vulnerable in its sleep. The late Ghanaian leader, Osagafo Kwame Nkrumah, implored that Africans must unite together or perish individually. Several episodes in human history have proven why this Pan or Pax Pan-Africanism is needed by Africa and the world. At the time of his writing, Nkrumah yearned for a new breed of African, a dedicated, modest, honest, informed man, a man who submerges himself in service to his nation and mankind, a man who abhors greed, detests vanity, and a new type of man whose humanity is his strength and whose integrity is his greatness. This was the new African citizens that Nkrumah longed for. However, this was the kind of African that existed before colonial intrusion. It is the case that Africa requires decolonization of its worldview. This is only possible through a united Africa under the African Union. Today, an average Oxonian knows more about the Black Pharaohs because the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford houses the ancient tombstones and altars of the Egyptian 25th dynasty. Whereas the descendants of these pharaohs in the modern Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Mali, and Senegal know little about them. They have been made to discard their ancestral bonds and made to believe instead the territorial integrity of the colonial nation states matter more. These colonial nation states were of course drawn up in the Berlin Conference of 1884. Today, the once thriving people of Great Zimbabwe are in discord with one another, threatened by a troubled economy and national ideological bankruptcy. It may suit powers that be that the sovereignty of colonial nation states remain integral, protected under the banner of national sovereignty. They would rather have it that way than have the intervention of the neighboring communities in the spirit of Ubuntu. Clearly, a closer African Union would preemptively engender the spirit of Ubuntu, a shared destiny in the new African ideology that protects the all within the continent. It is through such new ideology that the great Zimbabwe can again reincarnate itself and in fact cherish that heritage more than the colonial emblem of Cecil Road currently enjoys in its national flag. Today, the story of legendary boatsmen of Lake Chad, the ones whose mastery of waterways primed the human civilization of conquering the waterways of Nile, later rising along the banks of the Nile, the ancient civilizations that gave human pyramids and other ancient secrets of medicine. That is no more. Instead, it has been replaced by grotesque images of religious killings, inspired by new ideologies, only reprimanded by French interventions. Today, scholars of Timbuktu, who predate this historic University of Oxford, do not feature anymore as they did in history. They gave humanity an enlightenment at a time that Oxford and Harvard were unheard of. Rather, in the neighboring Nigeria, we currently have misguided militia protesting enlightenment in the name of Boko Haram, unaware that Africa once blessed humanity with the wisdom of having universities. The ancient pilgrims are being turned into images of discord to be torn down under the ideology of Islam. It was in the same region of present-day Mali that in the 13th century, in fact 50 years before Magna Carta, that the Mande Charter, known as Kruger Frugan, was first signed and stipulated that every life is a life. This set the course for what we know at the moment as human rights. Yet, the modern narrative would seek to educate the African on what human rights stands for as a foreign importation. I could mention more, but it is clear that Africa does not lack talent. It, however, needs to redefine its identity, to claim its rightful place where it can contribute to humanity as a whole and for the territorial integrity of African continent. Africa of today boasts many professionals, including a rocket scientist speaking on opposition tonight. But while Africa does not lack talent, it lacks the holding ground which calls for a closer union. Before I elaborate further, I would like to introduce those on the opposing side. First, to introduce the opposition would be Amen D'Souza, a first-year medical student from Christchurch, who clearly is stoked to wait and learn more about African Union tonight. Next would be Professor Arthur Matambura, a former president of one of the Movement for Democratic Change parties and Deputy Prime Minister of Zimbabwe between 2009 and 2013. Currently is Professor of Engineering and a Management Consultant. He's an Oxonian and a Pan-Africanist. He's quite unfortunate to be speaking in the opposition. On the side of opposition as well is Karen Kaneza Nantulia, who is an African Advocacy Director with the African Division at Human Rights Watch, an international NGO, which of course Karen knows would be best replaced by a closer and functional African Union. Mr. President, these are your guests and they're most welcome. The African Union is a progression from its earlier form, the Organization of African Unity. The AU is therefore conceptually old, and as it grows into its role, it has faced criticism from all corners of the world and also on the continent, very much getting confused, such that the emasculation of the African Union and therefore the justification for its needs is being confused for its unnecessariness. It is easy to point to the failures of African Union while failing to appreciate its benefits. Like any protective system, its role is appreciated much more when it actually fails than when it is functioning well. Imagine a majority in the audience tonight will appreciate much more a treatment for cholera. However, many in this audience would not have thought much about the role of waste management system. The council waste truck and workers as well as functioning toilets, which ensure that drinking water doesn't mix with stormwater would not appreciate the function of that system. Yet these are the very systems that keep our food safe, keeps the air clean, as well as water safe. Enough to prevent majority from getting sick in the first place, such as to need the treatment for cholera. Like a good waste management system, the African Union would continue to improve the unity of Africans, such that the necessity of having to have a close union is no longer required. But again, like a good waste management system, a public good in economic parlance, it would benefit from political endorsement as well as financial support afforded to council or relevant administration that manage waste system. It is within this prism of financial independence that African Union must be reappraised, with an eye to strengthening a closer union through a continent-wide political and financial support. A closer union means a financially and politically endorsed African Union that will address the shortcomings on which it has been vilified. Some on the opposing side would argue that Pax Pan-Africana is a rallying cry that stands to leave Africans vulnerable to human rights abuses, as the African Union will successfully fend off international intervention on the continent. The UN and other bodies are often welcomed in the name of responsibility to protect. They may say, where was the African Union when genocide happened in Rwanda? Where was it when the Western Sahara was denied the right to self-determination? Where was the African Union when Darfur got plundered by government-sponsored militia while Sudan's Bashir continues to enjoy immunity on the continent? Where is the African Union now that Kenya is being harassed for loans by the Chinese firms? Well, it is obvious that were it not for the Organization of African Unity and its subsequent progeny, the AU, some conflicts would still be raging on the continent. 1960s would not have been proclaimed as the year of African independence. Many countries would have had their independence delayed. It would have taken longer for Nelson Mandela to be freed and for South Africa to end apartheid. So evidently, while the AU is chided for discouraging external incursion into Africa, it is similarly blamed for not fending off the NATO-led intervention in Libya that ended in ouster and killing of Muammar Gaddafi, as well as the French-led ouster of President Laurent Gbagbo. That the AU is damned if it does, and damned if it doesn't, is an indication of a continent in need of transformative leadership, both to redefine its identity as well as to seek economic emancipation. That future is only possible under a closer African Union. Aside from a unified narrative that decolonizes African sovereignty, the need for a closer union also underlies its economic development. A closer African Union means a borderless African society whose territorial boundaries only reflect the internal cultural boundaries as they stood before colonization. These were boundaries with culture's chieftaincies or kingchiefs, permeated by philosophy of Ubuntu. That is, I am because we are. This is a foundational philosophy with positive implications that can be reclaimed in Pax Pan-Africana. As land is central to any economic activity, it behoves that the African philosophy aligns with Africa's practice of shared land ownership. A closer Africa, which trades with itself, will see the realization of the newly ratified African Continental Free Trade Area, which would, of course, be the world's largest economic bloc. In short term, countries like South Africa and Nigeria have held reservations which reflect their economic position. However, while South Africa fears influx of poorer workers from the neighboring countries, it is clear that South Africa would wield a respectable position within BRICS when the Congolese cobalt, 50% of the world's deficit, is also accessible only through the African Union, where South Africa would enjoy the advantage of using that as its negotiating tool. Nigeria similarly fears influx of poorer African workers, but how about a more respected Nigeria which can negotiate with France, which would be fully aware that the uranium mines that it seeks in Mali would only be accessible if it can negotiate fairly with Nigeria. A closer union leads to a bigger and collectively vibrant economy across Africa. But this is not only through land reforms and trade relations. Peace and security will also be enhanced. Africa of today is one where colonial powers still enjoy regional influences across the continent. This has time and again paralyzed progress as national political discourse is held hostage to neo-colonial ideals. Through tumultuous era of Cold War to the current geopolitical influx in global centers of power, a closer African Union presents a solution to political crisis on the continent, as well as the impending international challenge of Thucydides' trap. When Thucydides wrote the Peloponnesian Wars, he forewarned future societies to beware of the near inevitable clash between a rising power and a resident hegemon. Today, the world is arguably at that precipice. Fittingly, scholars ranging from Graham Allison of Harvard Kennedy School to an Oxonian and former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd have been thinking hard of ways to contravene what seems to be inevitable. Ladies and gentlemen, we know what the solution is: a united Africa. As much as space and global waterways appear to be the frontier within which the geopolitical flux plays out, it is clear that, acknowledged or not, the African continent is where the contest for resources and influence presents the greatest opportunity as well as the greatest threat for humanity. A closer Africa would mean a standardized rule of the game where a willing power has a central point of negotiation for the African resources as well as the African influence. This would obviously be good for Africa, but for humanity, as many students of economics and global business in this audience would attest. A market will clear when information supply and predetermined rules of the games are clear, and sales are done at fair price, at which the social and economic dividends would be optimally realized. For a fairer world, for a peaceful world, and for a rules-based world, it is in the collective interest of humanity that Africa unites, and unites now. So if you would like to hear the correct history of human civilization as it started in Africa, please vote for the proposition tonight. For a politically stable and economically advanced Africa, worthy of its human and material resources, a closer African Union is the only way forward. Similarly, if you want a peaceful world that would escape Thucydides' trap, a united Africa is our future as humanity. Clearly, we should all vote for the proposition tonight. Join me in proposing the motion. Thank you.